Prospective identification of knife offenders. Welcome to my video presentation on the prospective identification of knife offenders. My name is Iain Agar and I work as an analyst at Essex Police Force. We were one of 18 forces to receive funding for tackling knife crime. One of the first things I was asked to do when I joined Essex in 2019 was quite broadly to look at whether or not we can predict knife crime offenders. This was a partnership project sponsored by the Essex Centre for Data Analytics, a partnership including Essex Police Force, County Council and University of Essex, which brings together people and technology to tackle our most challenging issues with data. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about this process and then describe what we did, how successful we were compared to other practices, and I'll conclude with some reflections on the use of this tool and predictive algorithms more generally. Can we prospectively identify who will use a knife? Currently, most risk assessment tools predict reoffending among former offenders who are re-entering society. An example of this would be the Oasis Violence Predictor, which determines the percentage likelihood of any violent proven reoffence within 2 years. Validated tools designed to predict violence involving those currently residing in the community and specifically weapon violence within a large population are much less common. There isn't a significant volume of work out there currently which looks at how we might predict violence harm from weapons. Two pieces of work were influential in my approach to this. The first was a gun violence prediction tool developed by Andrew Wheeler and others at the University of Dallas, which sought to quantify how well they could predict future involvement of gun violence in a larger sample of 200,000 individuals known to police. This work contained a detailed method on how such a tool can be built and tested using information readily available in all police systems. There is a long history of theory and research exploring firearms violence specifically in the US, from which this work was able to draw on. However, in the United Kingdom, there is very little detailed analysis on knife-enabled violence or rigorous testing of risk factors. The second step in enabling a public health approach to violence is to identify risk and protective factors. Without this, we are unable to develop effective prevention strategies. The second influential work is Weapon Carrying and the Reduction of Violent Harm by Iain Brennan at the University of Hull. Using data from over 25,000 completed responses to the Offending Crime and Justice Survey, he found that weapon carriers could be distinguished using relatively few characteristics, which included demographics, behaviours, associates, and neighbourhood features. This provided evidence around risk and protective factors specific to knives in England and Wales and provided the causal thinking for the problem I sought to explore at Essex. Testing theory with police data. Before attempting to build a data model to predict knife use, the first thing I did was to complete a problem profile on knife-enabled crime in Essex, testing the hypotheses of Iain's work using police crime data and exploring any other lines of inquiry that come up when considering victims, offenders, locations, attractors, and enhancers. Using descriptive analysis, I found that weapon use is more likely among males under the age of 25, among those known for any type of prior violent offending, those known for involvement in use or supply of any illicit drugs, and was more likely among those with criminal peers or associates, and involving those residing in more disordered neighbourhoods. Knife use perpetrators were less represented as victims in the police data, although intelligence on individuals did sometimes counter this finding, suggesting higher rates of underreporting. An additional finding was that mental health, suicide, and self-harm are highly prevalent enablers, as judged by warning markers attached often to perpetrators over the age of 25. A key finding for Essex was that identified knife use reoffending was low, which might infer sanctions are effective, but also place more emphasis on the need to focus on prevention rather than consequences. Predictor variables available in police data. This is the first ECDA project where data from just one agency was used. The aim of this project is to deal with the violence here and now, whereby the most influential risk factors are criminogenic and proximate to the outcome. This means we have what we need, and the aim is tertiary prevention and enabling more immediate impact. Previous learning from our pilot violence project was that sharing data across organisations was beneficial for strategic responses to inform primary and secondary prevention, but something different was required for those further along in the life course. What predictor variables are readily available to us in policing data? We have static factors. These are fixed or in the past and will not change. They include age at the time of the incident, sex, and previous crimes where an individual has been identified as a victim or a named suspect. Dynamic factors are associated with the changing likelihood of risk over time, including the rate of calls for service or crimes or cumulative harm in an area where an individual lives, enhancers such as misuse and/or engagement in illicit drug markets, criminal associates or co-offenders, and geographic locations where an individual lives or experiences crime. Some dynamic factors we can address to reduce risk, for example, access to drug and alcohol or mental health treatment and support. These are sometimes called criminogenic needs. The only data used in this modelling was derived from crime investigations data. There was no information taken from arrest and custody databases, intelligence reports, or stops other than where leading to drug and possession of offensive weapons offences. The reason for this decision is that proactive and targeted proactive work can often be led by human decisions with definition labeling problems, i.e. the targeting of gangs, or they can include intensive periods of focus which might disproportionately affect specific places or demographics, i.e. targeting a single network in one town. The model did use a weighted harm score, with one model using the crime severity and a separate using the Cambridge Crime Harm Index. Statistical regression algorithm. The first rule of algorithms is you do not talk about algorithms, as Jay Ratcliffe says on the Reducing Crime podcasts. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in data science and statistics, because I am not. I've been on a steep learning curve in the past couple of years to the point where I understand what this is, how it works, and what it tells us. The method points shown with the statistical terminology is the processes I have undertaken with support from colleagues at the University of Essex. While the learning curve has been steep, the hardest part has been trying to find the best way to communicate this information effectively with a wider audience, and then making it clear how we use these kind of tools to achieve the desired impact, which I will do in the following slides. Before moving on, the inputs to this are 40,000 individuals who were known to Essex Police as named suspects of community violence during a 4-year period covering 2015 to 2019, including just fewer than 1 in 20 who went on to commit a knife-enabled offence. Unlike some risk tools whereby an individual may be chosen by a human, subsequently scored and added into a matrix, or whereby individuals are chosen based on ambiguous labelling, this tool is focused around aspects of explicit, problematic and harmful behaviours that would be clear to the people causing and/or experiencing harm and practitioners seeking to provide solutions. How does the model arrive at its prediction? This is a reduced version to demonstrate what the risk model is doing. A decision tree which detects interactions between an individual's risk variables and whether the individual went on to commit a knife-enabled crime. We already know the outcome for these individuals and if they used a knife. We are trying to determine if the specific risk factors and behaviours proximate to that event are predictive. For each individual, we can follow the tree path. So the model asks a series of questions about the person until we get to one of around 30 grey boxes at the bottom. Each box has a score, the percentage of people in this subcohort who went on to use a knife in violence. For example, if we start at the top of the tree, the first point tells us whether an individual has previously been named as a suspect for community violence in Essex. If not, and we follow that arrow, it takes us straight to a grey box at the bottom. No one in this group went on to commit a knife use offence in the next 12 months. Numerically, this is also the largest cohort of people with 9,000 individuals. But what about the highest risk within the model? If we went back to the top and move in the other direction, the first move tells us that these individuals have on at least 2 occasions been a named suspect in a community violence offence. They have co-accused or associates they have offended with. If we follow the line for where this exceeds 5 or more offending associates to sex, then we follow the arrow for male, we get to a cohort that have either carried a weapon or display a drugs marker, or both. 35 to 75% of these individual 3 cohorts went on to commit a knife use offence. These final 3 groups contain 1,000 individuals, including a third of those who form our knife-enabled crime cohort. Specific people with specific harmful behaviours are disproportionately concentrated. These individuals are what you might have also heard being referred to as the power few or sticky. I would like to point out that whilst causal thinking was used in selecting risk variables, such models are not proof of causal inference. We can say that participating or being exposed to these risky behaviours increases the probability that you may become a victim and/or perpetrator of knife-enabled crime, but we cannot categorically say that these harmful and risky behaviours are the cause. The most influential factors in determining the score were weighted crime harm, previously having been a suspect for violence, age at the time of the incident, and the total number of criminal associates. Is it more accurate than current practice? Firstly, forget about percentages. The most unrealistic expectation is perfection. The correct baseline of accuracy should be current practice. Can a machine model identify risk more accurately than a police officer or practitioner? The goals we should be thinking about include: how accurately can we identify those who pose a significant risk? Which methods can be used to allocate resources most efficiently? And how transparent are they? Everyone involved should be able to understand how such tools work, as well as their strengths and weaknesses. Notwithstanding, it is also important to consider that many factors beyond the influence or control of policing can encourage or discourage crime, and these factors change over time. For example, employment rates and job markets, income levels, prison populations, or even global pandemics. We don't know how much these external factors can affect forecasting accuracy over time, or if it even affects them at all. So how do we know if this is better than other techniques currently used to identify weapon violence? First, we can look at the literature. Research with police officers has identified that the ability to accurately identify the most harmful offenders is low. A recent study of 123 police officers in one English city found that judgment of the most prolific offenders was 91% incorrect, and for the most harmful, 95% incorrect. This is not surprising if we consider that, whilst collectively police officers may deal over time with some harmful individuals frequently, they are not always going to be dealt with by the same officers. We have hundreds of officers making thousands of records each month. It's incomprehensible that frontline professionals would have the time to bring it all together, to research, analyse, and then determine where and who to focus their efforts on. More rigorously, we can use the available data to model these practices and compare them to the predictive model. A number of police forces monitor habitual knife carriers, determined by coming to notice at least twice for knife possession offences or knife wounding offences in the previous 2 years, with one offence occurring within the previous 12 months. When looking at the temporal proximity of knife-enabled offences and knife carrying, just 17% of those who committed a knife-enabled offence had carried a knife, with significantly fewer having committed a previous knife wounding offence. Applying the inclusion criteria for habitual knife carrier lists to historic data, we can determine that they have low predictive accuracy. So, how did the Essex model do in comparison? Compared to the other practices, pretty well. I'll choose just 2 probability scores to describe the success of the model and how we are using it. For those who had a probability score greater than 35%, half of those targeted would have been expected to go on and use a knife. If we target resources to all those who had a probability score greater than 65%, then more than 70% of those targeted would have gone on to use a knife. Although this isn't perfect and needs to be used with caution, it represents a significant improvement on current practice and demonstrates clearly how evidence-based tools can enhance policing and community safety. Is it fairer? Is it more transparent? What are the ethical considerations? One of the challenges of this kind of project is fairness, transparency, and ethics, particularly when in relation to the subject of serious violence and weapon crime. There has been a high level of scrutiny and criticism of tools which are intended to forecast risk of weapon-enabled violence based on, firstly, how they work to arrive at their predictions, and secondly, how they are used in practice. Whilst I go through these examples, you might want to think of a time in the past where you might have received a list of names with a score or a red, amber, green colour system, and the only instruction you're given is, these are the top people, what are you doing about them? And were there any adverse consequences in that approach? I've selected here what I think would be some of the more common risks encountered in this kind of work. Misuse of the tool. This can happen when it's learnt that a person's risk score can be influenced by targeting them, such as carrying out more stops or submitting more intelligence reports. It can happen when officers police the list rather than the community, or when we start to interpret high risk as most wanted. To avoid this, people need training on how to use the information they are being provided. A key lesson is that risk is not destiny. Use tools to enhance professional judgment, but don't follow them blindly. Challenging identification. This can happen when individuals do not know their information is being processed. This model is focused on patterns of specific and identified violent behaviours and does not assign ambiguous labels to those affected. This is a fairer and more transparent use of the data. This was also highlighted as a key finding in the work to reduce shootings in the south of Manchester in the late 1990s. Recording errors and poor data quality are inevitable due to the volume and complexity of police data. We can mitigate this to some extent, for example, by leaving out incomplete or partial records from the model. The capturing of whether an offence is knife-enabled or not also can suffer from recording inaccuracies. At Essex, we have addressed this particular systematic data quality risk by making knife flags mandatory for selected categories of crime. The use of socio-demographics and economic data may prevent equal treatment of all persons and risk discriminating. We do not use socioeconomic factors or ethnicity data in the scoring model. The mitigation has been to develop a causal model with the minimum amount of data fields required to answer the problem. Acting proportionately. Algorithmic predictions can be wrong, as can professional judgments, and this poses a risk of acting on inaccurate data. The tool enhances practitioner work and enables efficient targeting of resources, but it is not there, for example, as justification for proactive enforcement in the absence of intelligence. The final one is disproportionate focus. Unfortunately, it is a fact that knife use and serious violence are clustered in a small proportion of physical spaces, hotspots, which are more frequently socially and economically disadvantaged areas, and inevitably this will result in a focus on those groups. When an attempt was made to deliver a focused deterrence model under Operation Shield in the London Borough of Haringey, engaging and gaining the support of the local community was one of the greatest challenges, and before any progress could be made, practitioners had to engage and gain consent from previously disengaged groups. Next step, testing. The first part of this work to enable targeting has been completed. We have a tool that we are ready to trial, and from a statistical perspective, we can test and assess the prospective accuracy of its predictions. Reproducibility with police data opens the possibility for cross-validating the model in other forces. The second stage of the project, which is applying practices to those individuals at heightened risk, is currently being designed, working with practitioners and offender managers at the Essex Violence Reduction Unit. The response is being informed by research and evidence about what works, and our initial ideas are to share the model outputs with non-police agencies who can engage and divert individuals by addressing their criminogenic needs. which is how the reward basis of focused deterrence interventions function, working with high-risk individuals in the community who are willing to desist and engage. A decision has been made that targeting of enforcement activity will not be informed or directed by the model. Attempts at focused deterrence in England to date have produced limited or mixed results, often citing the lack of resources and partnership commitment to fulfilling the reward offer, or being able to follow through swiftly with threatened sanctions. We are considering at Essex what resources are required so that we can deliver on outreach and support to address needs which may relate to education, skills, access to employment, social support, health and behavioural change, for example. All chief executives across the force within public sector organisations have been briefed on the model and the work of the Violence Reduction Unit, and have been told what is required and asked how they can fully support this process to guarantee that those offers of support can be delivered to divert people away from harmful outcomes. So, in summary, using a relatively small number of variables, our algorithm to predict knife use in violence outperforms current habitual knife carrier lists and expert knowledge. However, there is some way to go before it can be deployed operationally whilst we design and test responses. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to discuss this further, I can be contacted using the details displayed.